People not migrating to cities is a good thing. Let's cover some interesting contents going on. What kicked off this topic was an intriguing commentary by Dhananjay Sinha, head of research at Systematics Group. He raised some fascinating, and frankly, less obvious questions about the decline in migration, questions that challenge the conventional narrative. Questions that are not obvious but should be asked. But before I dive into it, let me first explain what migration actually means. Migration, at its core, is about movement, usually from rural areas to urban centers, driven by the hope of better job opportunities, higher wages, and improved living standards. But in recent years, a new trend has emerged: migration declining. The reasons for this shift are far from clear-cut, which is what makes it so intriguing. The Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, EACPM, recently published data suggesting that rural India is doing quite well. Their study, titled 400 Million Dreams, found that rural to urban migration had dropped significantly, by 53.7 million people, or 11.8%, over the past decade. Now, that sounds like really good news, right? People aren't migrating to cities, maybe because rural areas are doing extremely well. That's what the EACPM attributed this decline to: improved government services in rural areas, like better healthcare, education, infrastructure, and connectivity, which they believe are giving people fewer reasons to leave their hometowns. It's a comforting hypothesis, the idea that rural India is thriving and people are staying back because they no longer feel the need to flock to overcrowded cities for survival. But Dhananjay Sinha isn't entirely convinced. He argues that this narrative might be oversimplifying the situation. In his view, the story of reverse migration might not be about rural abundance at all. Instead, it could reflect something more concerning: the diminishing appeal of urban centers. Let's look at some of the data. The EACPM study highlighted that remittances, money sent home by migrants, have declined in many states like Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh, which are traditionally known for outbound migration. Fewer remittances might mean fewer people leaving in the first place, challenging the idea of thriving rural economies. It suggests that people may not be staying back because they're finding great opportunities in rural areas, but because cities are no longer the magnets they once were. Sinha also points to stagnating urban growth as a possible factor. Urban centers, which once symbolized opportunity and upward mobility, are now grappling with slowing economic activity, rising costs of living, and limited job creation. Combine this with the rise of automation and the effects of the pandemic, and you have a scenario where urban India might not seem worth the risk for many rural workers. And if rural areas were actually becoming more attractive, rural wages would be growing much faster. But looking at the data, rural wage growth is barely keeping up with inflation. So, it's unlikely that people are staying back because of decent opportunities. In rural areas, rural wage growth paints a very different picture. And then, there's the question of rural infrastructure. The EACPM cites government programs like rural electrification and the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Gramin as key drivers of reverse migration. But Sinha points out that these developments, while important, don't fully explain the trend. For instance, 86% of rural India was already electrified by 2001, long before migration trends began reversing. Similarly, while the PMAY has added millions of houses in rural areas, the growth rate of these projects hasn't been as transformative as one might expect. So, what's really going on here? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. But nobody can really say why the rural to urban migration is declining. That's it for this edition. Do let us know what you think in the comments, and share with your friends to make them smarter as well.